I'm Natalia Loback, and this is Change the Conversation. Today, I'm here with Dipal Damani, who is the founder and president of D&D Inclusion Consulting. Welcome, Dipal.
Hi, Natalia. Thank you for having me on board for this.
I'm so excited to talk to you today, and I'm really excited for our viewers to hear what you have to say. So, we have a lot of overlap and a lot of things in common. I mean, I find in change that if we don't go into change, especially big organizational change, with a lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we miss a lot of opportunities, and often change can be quite unequal. Tell me about the work that you do, because I understand that you are at the forefront of organizations that want to make changes inside their organization.
Yeah, no. So I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant and practitioner, and so I go into organizations and conduct organizational audits on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So you could say it's somewhat of a change management process. So certainly there's intersection with change management when conducting these organizational audits.
You know, what's so interesting to me is, as a change practitioner, I often get the output of these kind of initiatives. So where organizations have made decisions, they've done an investigation, they've made decisions, and now they need help with the how and the implementation. What I find really interesting about the work that you do is that it's at the beginning. So organizations are looking inward and saying, do we need to look at ourselves differently? What are some things that we need to take into consideration? Can you tell me a little bit about what has been driving the need for these services over the last few years? There have been some big changes.
Yeah, definitely, Natalia, there has been. And I would say a significant event and an unfortunate one that happened was the murder of George Floyd. And then after that were the Black Lives Movement protests following the murder of George Floyd. And I think that really sort of raised the consciousness among organizations on taking that deep dive inward with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion, with respect to, what is it that we need to be doing better. And so I really, I do commend organizations for not only raising their consciousness and awareness on this, but also taking that step forward to do organizational audits, DEI audits. And they're not, they can be a scary process. As with any change management process, it can be a scary process, but especially I think when you start to layer in race, marginalization, when you start to layer in those identities into the audit process, I think that really gets people's back against the wall and can be a very scary process, especially for the senior leadership team. And in most of our, certainly in North American society, most of our senior leadership team are white, and depending on the industry or sector you're in, tend to be white men and older white men. So doing a organizational DEI audit, when you start to layer in the experience of race, of gender, of disability, etc., it becomes a scary experience for a lot of these senior leadership teams. And it doesn't necessarily have to be if you're prepared in advance of that audit.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Like what you're talking about is this, it can be a scary experience. It can, generate some fairly strong emotional responses. And it's interesting when people are faced with change, whether it's change that happens to them or change that they are pursuing, whether they realize that, given what has happened in society, it's actually really imperative and important that we look at our organizations and we look at the systems that we've created. We talk about that, that fear, and fear is an emotional response, and it creates huge barriers to change. So when people are fearful and they're scared, you get all sorts of, negative reactions in terms of, how willing people are to, internalize or accept findings, willing to change, all of that kind of stuff. So fear can be a really big driver to, challenging results, challenging organizations, all of the above. What are you finding in terms of, some of that mix and sort of makeup in, in the various broad experience that you have?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, on that point about fear, some organizations have, go into it with fear. And I find some are going into it without fear. And so what's the difference between those going into it with fear and those without, right? And what's the outcome of those that go in with fear or without fear? So the organizations that go into it with fear, I find, are often not prepared in advance of an audit. And so when they get an audit that shows findings that, and the findings are to show what's going well in an organization, but also to show what's not going well and an opportunity for change. Now, when an organization hasn't been prepared for that audit, go into it with a mindset of fear, they tend to be defensive with the findings, especially when the findings do not, support, I think, what they had thought was happening in the organization. And so when the findings tend to uncover some ugly truths, right, about the organization, the leadership tends to get defensive. Now, for those organizations, that don't go into it with fear, what's the difference? I have found in my experience the difference is that they've had some type of training. They've had some type of training around diversity, equity, inclusion. What does that mean? What does race mean? What does disability mean? What does gender identity mean, etc. Right? So they've got some familiarization with terminology, but and also an understanding of systemic oppression, systemic racism, etc., and how that is perpetuated in an organization, perpetuated in society, and how as an individual, regardless actually of our own race, sometimes how we contribute to those systems. But more so if you are white, privileged, man, how you are perpetuating those systems. So by having that understanding, having that of DEI and understanding of our position and our power and our privilege, we're less fearful going into a audit and less fearful of what those findings may show us, and more accepting if those findings uncover ugly truths, because we've now been able to shift our mindset from defensiveness, because we've received that training, to being aware of what we're receiving through that finding and moving very quickly on to acceptance, which is key, Natalia, which I believe you will support, is key to change.
Absolutely.
And then moving into change, right? Moving into organizational change. So that's what I find is the key difference between those that are going into it with fear and those that are not going into it with fear. They've received some type of training, and may have even conducted a self-audit through a intercultural audit or what have you, but have also been able to assess their own bias and privilege and power, etc. So they've done some of that work in advance of the audit.
I really, really resonate with what you're saying. And, I'm going to jump off something that you said and just talk a little bit about, how we as people and how we as groups embark on change. And, I look at organizations and I look at groups of people as systems. So, and, you have that layer on as well of, colonial, patriarchal, racist systems that, we are all a part of and participate in. And, systems, when we want to change systems, they're, it's more of a complex process than it is just saying, oh, we're going to slap in a new process and everyone's just going to do it. And that's kind of the way it is. often when we're embarking on a big organizational shift, especially when it has to do with culture, because so much of the work that you're talking about has to do with the way the organization operates, which isn't like necessarily some process or some procedure or some policy that's written. It's about how that lives out. So how do people speak to each other? How do they treat each other? What is the culture and that fabric of the organization?
That's where we're going to end the conversation for today. But stay tuned. We'll be back next week where Dipal and I continue our conversation and get in deeper about the work that she's doing in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. In the meantime, if you want to learn more about Dipal and her business, please connect with us on our website, charthouse.ca, and check out the show notes under Change the Conversation. You can also find all of our previous episodes on our YouTube channel, linked below. And I look forward to seeing you next week as Dipal and I wrap up this incredible conversation.